Hello, geologists of Texas State. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for watching my GSA talk. I'm coming to you from Montreal, where it's currently snowed already about 4 inches. It's 9 o'clock in the morning, so I hope you're grateful for your weather conditions. I'm a bit jealous right now, but anyway, to your questions. How can you tell that some microfractures are associated with pseudotachylyte and some are not? Excellent question. We spent a lot of time in the field agonizing over that. So where Catherine Ross was mapping, we have these beautiful, sharp, continuous pseudotachylyte veins. And then around them, we see these microfractures. And sometimes they're actually touching the vein, and you can see that melt from the pseudotachylyte has entered the microfracture. So that's like clearly associated, right? But then sometimes they're a little bit away, and at least in the outcrop surface where we don't see an intersection. And that doesn't mean that they don't intersect at some point in the three-dimensional volume of the rock. But if we can't see it, then we can't guarantee it. So one of the things we did was look in thin section and find like tiny micro pseudotachylytes along those veins. And then the other thing we did is we kind of had to define a class of structures that were likely affiliated with the veins. And that was based on kinematic arguments. Like if the slip on the vein, on the main vein of pseudotachylyte clearly caused like dilation and opening in one site. And then we had these little faults there that were the structures that actually accommodated that opening. Then we said those are probably associated. Okay. Next question. I would think that the forces required to produce pseudotachylyte, although intense, would be fairly common in seismic events. Correct. Yes. Could you explain the rarity of the material's occurrence and why it is produced in such limited quantities? Great question. So, two things. I actually don't think it's that rare. I think most earthquakes probably produce pseudotachylyte, as long as they're just big enough. And there's Lauterbrook and Sass in the 1980s kind of figured out how to calculate how much heat is produced by frictional sliding on a fault. And there's been like some customizations of that so far, but it's a relatively simple calculation to figure out how much heat is produced and how much, so what the temperature rise should be. So the trick is the temperature rise or the energy associated with it is distributed over some amount of slip. So if you have a very thin fault, like it's a millimeter thick, then it's easy to melt the whole thing because all of your temperature rise is concentrated in a very small volume of rock. But if the shearing zone's a little thicker, it rapidly decreases the amount of total temperature rise for the earthquake energy that you're producing. So one thing is, I think it's possible that some earthquakes slip zones get thicker and thinner in places, and so you wouldn't see melting where the earthquake slip zone was thicker. The other thing that I think is a really big factor is that people don't know how to recognize pseudotachylytes, and they also just don't last very long because a little thin sheet of glass in a big active fault zone, if you add water, if water comes up through the fault zone, spreads through the system, it reacts with the glass really quickly and makes clay or micas or epidote. I've seen them altered to tourmaline. Like they alter really quickly and then they just look like mineral veins. So they don't last very long in the rock record and people don't know how to recognize them. So I do think they're a lot more abundant than people think. Yeah. Okay. Next question. Compelling, very understandable. Thank you. The study of earthquakes is so cool, especially when looking at the different rock characteristics and deformation that happens before, during, and after a seismic event. The way she used stress and deformation at the fault zone to learn more about earthquakes is really clever. Oh, thank you. I have to give credit to my students. I'm not really the brains in this operation. Okay. Confusing, some jargon, but in a way that led to better understanding of both the definitions of the study. Yeah, that's kind of what I was going for, if we're honest. Yeah, thanks. I'm also trying to make up my own jargon, which is a very slippery slope, but we just don't have enough terminology to describe all the things you can see. Okay, what is quench time? What is off-fault fracturing? Is it literally fracturing that does not occur on the fault, but near one? Yes, exactly that. Okay, so quench time, when you produce that little frictional melt, it's super thin, right? But so everything in that layer had to be above the melting point of the rock. So in the rocks of Fort Foster, it's mostly plagioclase and hornblende. So the melting point of plagioclase is maybe like, it's kind of a calcic plagioclase. So it could be quite hot, like 1200, maybe 1300 degrees. So we think that the melt layer was that hot. The surrounding rock is at high green schist conditions, so maybe 450 degrees before the earthquake occurred. So you have this huge thermal gradient between the little melt layer and the rock around it. So it doesn't take very long for that heat to dissipate. And so what we did is calculate, like, how long would it take for that melt to cool down to, say, 600 or 700 degrees, so we could be sure that everything in the rock was either crystalline or quenched to glass. It was definitely solid. So that's the quench time that we calculated. So that gives us an idea of, like, when we're looking at these structures that have the melt flowing into them, how long was the melt actually fluid so that that structure has that amount of time to form. And off-fault fracturing, is fracturing that occurs near the fault. And so, like the faults that Catherine studied, they have some bumps in them. So if you have them interlocking bumps, when the fault starts to slide, you get stuck on these geometric bumps, and then the rock has to fracture and give and kind of release some of the stress on those bumps. And so that's like off-fault fracturing that caused by and facilitates the earthquake sliding. So it's like clearly tied to the earthquake. Okay, does recycling mean sheared out to outside layering? What do multi-generational layers mean? Two good questions. Okay, so yes, recycling means we started with a myelinite, earthquake propagated through, it melted some of the myelinite to make the pseudotachylyte. And then when I call it recycled, when that pseudotachylyte has recrystallized and coarsened back up so that it's basically just a layer in the myelinite again. And my friend Nancy Price, who also worked with her for her PhD on a different part of the shear zone, kind of counted these old layers that were just part of the myelinite, just part of the striping, and found like maybe as much as 50% of the rock looked a little bit like an old pseudotachylyte. So this is a cycle that happens again and again and again, recycling of the rock in the shear zone. Multi-generational layers. I can't remember what I was talking about when I said that, but like when you look at a pseudotachylyte vein and you're like, oh, here's 1 millimeter of melt that was formed during this earthquake. That's proportional in some way to the amount of slip, which is proportional to the size of the earthquake. Is it magnitude 4 or 6? Now, if you go over here and you find a 3 millimeter thick melt, either that's a much bigger earthquake, we found a 7, or 3 magnitude 4s, one on top of the other. So one of the things that we look for in thin section is to find out, if you see flow swirling through the layer, then that layer is kind of indivisible. But sometimes you see this parallel cross-cutting where you can actually see one layer. And it kind of makes sense because if you have a pseudotachylyte vein that's already cut through the rock, the interface between that pseudotachylyte and the wall rock is a weak point. And so it's a likely point for further fracturing. So whenever we want to look at the energy of a particular earthquake, we have to be very careful to make sure that we're not accidentally summing the effects of multiple earthquakes together. It was pretty much completely lost in the slides about Coulombs. Yeah, okay, fair, because you know what? I didn't show that data because the plots are confusing. So the Coulomb stress change is a way of calculating, like, for example, you have a fault and it's got a bump. And let's say that that fault slips in an earthquake. And then what it does after the slip is it leaves the system a little bit more stressed in some places and less stressed in others. Like you're releasing over here, you're more stressed over here. So assuming that we live in an elastic block of cheese, which is the way that we usually calculate the Earth, no heterogeneities, no permanent deformation, then if you know the amount of slip and you know the fault shape, then you can say, oh, the stress increased by 6 bars over here and decreased by 2 bars over there. And the stress changes are usually quite small because the Earth is very stiff. But that's what Kat was up calculating. So there's a free package that runs in MATLAB that people use to do this all the time. It's offered by the USGS. So the reason why people do those calculations is to say, okay, we had this one big earthquake. Is this nearby fault now more or less likely to slip? Like was the stress load on that fault increased or decreased? So it's quite useful for that. Okay, question. What does reloaded for the next slip mean? Stress and loading patterns look baffling. Agreed. Okay. Well, okay, so here, this goes to the problem of thinking about the Earth as a totally elastic space again. But the idea being that every fault has some amount of stress on it in the crust, even if it's just the stress caused by the loading, and then because of the expanded compressibility of the Earth, then it can apply horizontal stress. And then we have the tectonic stresses also that might be more horizontal. So when is a fault actually going to slip under those conditions? Like the vertical load doesn't change very much over hundreds or thousands of years, but the tectonic stresses can increase as the plates are moving, even if it's quite far away from the fault. So at some point, at some moment, the stress in the fault reaches the threshold strength of the fault, and then it goes, and then you have an earthquake. So after the earthquake, it's released some amount of that stress. It's accommodated that load. It's deformed to take care of that stress. But it's not at a zero stress state. We don't have a complete stress drop to like unloaded. There's still some stress on it. And then that stress is now going to start accumulating again because the fault's locked up and the tectonics are still moving. So it's that kind of like what actually gets you to that triggering point, and then where does the slip stop? What kind of load is left after that? Because we know that there's some load left because we see after slip in the same direction as the slip during the earthquake. So yes, it is baffling. It's hard to get to because stress is really hard to measure, as I'm sure Owen's told you about. Okay, last one. Comment, turns out it's question 2. I hadn't associated the healing rate of fractures relative to depth. Would it make sense that healing would occur quickly in a hotter zone, or would it be a cooler zone? Good question. So it depends. There's lots of different ways that fractures can heal. And in the Norenberg shear zone, where the rocks are at 400 or 500 degrees, and we see lots of ductile strain, then probably those fractures are just very quickly healed by dynamic recrystallization and shear by crystal plasticity. In the shallower crust, it's more common to see mineral cements filling fractures and gluing the rock back together, or fractures just like slowly closing on their own. And yeah, anyway, so we can see healing around faults. And in fact, like around the San Andreas Fault, there's a zone in which seismic waves go very slowly. It's low rigidity, that rock, because of all the fractures in the damage zone. And after an earthquake, if you have seismometers that are closely spaced around the fault, and you can pick up earthquakes coming from far away, coming the waves through the fault, just so they're sampling the fault zone, you can actually see over the course of years or tens of years, the rocks start to stiffen up again after an earthquake. It's pretty impressive. Okay, thank you so much for your questions. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. Please email me if you have any more questions or you want to chat. Okay, bye.